Hello guys. Now looking into the second section of credit risk. In the last section, we know that if there is a possibility of default, if there is counterparty obligations which are there, and if that risk exists, this is always referred to as credit risk. And there are various ways in which the credit risk can be reduced. And we looked at various credit risk instruments also. Let's look at some of the instruments in depth. There is something called as the credit default swaps. Now, for you to understand in terms of the credit default swaps, you will be consider in terms of one example, wherein you will be able to notice that you consider that there is a risk which is associated, and you guys are all the buyers. You know that there is some amount of counterparty risk that will happen in the future. Okay, so if this is the case, what you want is you want to transfer this risk to someone else. Now if that is the case, what we do in insurance also is we know that there will be some amount of risk which will be involved. So what we do is, since I know that there is some risk with respect to, it might be a disease, it might be with respect to um, a house, or in terms of a calamity, it might be anything. So what we do is we will be able to go and buy an insurance. So in credit default swaps also, you know that there might be possibility of credit risk. So for which you will be able to go and buy an product, or in terms of an instrument. So you will be referred to as the buyer of insurance product. Here in this case, we will be able to refer to that as product protection buyer. Now, once we have in terms of the protection buyer in insurance also, what we do, we will be able to pay some premium amount to the insurance companies, which are nothing but the companies which sell these products. So the protection buyer will be able to pay the premium to the protection seller. In return, what we want is, if the risk actually occurs, if the event actually occurs, the protection seller should be able to make the appropriate payments during the event day. So the same concept of insurance, if it is applied to credit risk instruments, this is always referred to as credit default swaps. So you will be able to notice that there is a protection buyer who will be able to take some protection based upon the credit risk that he will be able to forecome in the future, which is referred to as a reference obligation. If the actual event occurs, if the default actually occurs, then the protection seller will be able to make that payment, which is equivalent to how much is the risk involved. If the event doesn't occur, you will be able to notice, similar to insurance, the premium is the amount which will be earned by, in terms of the protection seller, or in terms of the insurance seller. Now, thus, if you find the differences between the credit risk instruments, such as in terms of credit default swaps with respect to other financial instruments or derivatives that you have learned, you will be able to notice that it is more or less like a swap, wherein you will be able to notice that there is premium which is paid, and in the occurrence of the event, the amount will be paid by, in terms of the protection seller. And you will be able to notice that in case of default only, the protection seller will be able to compensate. And the if the occurrence of the default event doesn't occur, there is no need for you to exercise it. And thus, that during the if you look at in terms of the settlement, the CDS concludes on a scheduled termination date. So there is a specific date which is there. Within that specific date, if the event happens, then the protection seller has to be able to make that payment. Yeah, or otherwise the protection seller gains will be nothing but the premiums that they have obtained from the protection buyer. And thus, you will be able to notice that when it comes to a few key aspects is, where we talk about nominal value of this swap, credit default swap will be nothing but what is the obligation or reference that you are considering, what is the value of it, and what is the market value at the time of the credit event. So if we do consider in this way, you will be able to notice what is the actual nominal value, and what is the value that will be there when this event, if it occurs. That is nothing but the nominal value of the swap. And when it comes to cooling off period, it is nothing but the time between the date of the credit event which is there minus the actual valuation date. And if we are able to consider the swap that fixes that amount in case of the default, irrespective of assessment of actual loss, this is always referred to as in terms of the binary swap. Now, we looked at credit default swaps. So there is something called as a total return swap. Now, you will be able to notice the key difference that exists between the credit default swap as well as in terms of the total return swap is as a buyer. Okay, so you will be able to notice that the buyer as well as in terms of the seller, you will have what is called as the total return payer and in terms of total return receiver, and everything is based upon certain reference obligations only. Now here the key difference which exists is nothing but you will be able to notice the total return payer who is there will be able to make the entire total return payments for in return what do they require is in terms of the floating rate plus in terms of the spread. So you can consider this as an arrangement where one party pays the total return of a reference asset such as bonds in exchange for receiving floating rate of return plus in terms of a spread. So consider this in case of a bond. If you have a bond, you know that you will be able to get coupon payments, which is nothing but fixed. So as a total return payer, you will be able to make some fixed payments, which is nothing but total return. But you will be able to receive the floating payments plus in terms of the spread which is there. And thus, if you do consider in terms of the total return swaps with respect to that of various other vanilla swaps as well as the credit default swaps, you will be able to notice that when compared to CDS, TRS is always considered much better, is for the reason that there is a superior protection for the payer, and in CDS there is no compensation for decline in the value of the reference asset, and it is always in terms of most of the time it is in terms of fixed but based upon the nominal value. But you will be able to notice that in TRS, if there is any decline, okay, that decline will be compensated by in terms of the seller. And similarly in TRS, the receiver would compensate the loss of value of the reference asset apart from in terms of the default risk, which is always advantageous, because if you looked at in terms of the credit default swaps, you will be able to notice on the occurrence of the event, you protection seller will be able to make in terms of the payment. But if the reference entity which is there, the value of it has reduced, he will not be able to compensate for it, which is done here in terms of the total return. Okay, so the total return receiver will be able to compensate for it. And similarly when it comes to in terms of the credit linked notes, okay, so in the credit linked notes you will be able to notice in the credit default swaps there was no cash flow from the protection seller to the protection buyer at the inception of the swap. So you will be able to notice here that when we consider credit default swaps, the protection buyer, like an insurance, uh, like we are buying in terms of an insurance, we always pay in terms of some premium, and the protection seller will be able to make some payment only on the occurrence of the event. This is always referred to as unfunded, because the protection seller is not giving you anything in advance. But if this amount is paid in advance by the protection seller to the protection buyer, then this will automatically become as funded. Okay, and thus it is usually achieved. You will be able to notice that there will be issuance of note by the protection buyer, which is bought by in terms of the protection seller, and thus the protection seller will be able to make some upfront payment, and thus such an instrument is always referred to as in terms of the credit linked notes. And you will be able to notice that the entire 2008 financial crisis that we discussed in the last video completely arrived because of the instruments, and these instruments were referred to as CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. Now we understood that uh, the based upon the loans which were EMIs which were supposed to be given by the borrowers, the investment banks were able to create uh, some securities out of it, which was referred to as securitization. So that process, if you understand here, what these banks have done is they have converted all the future EMIs that they will be able to get from the various borrowers, that is being converted, and this conversion is referred to as securitization. The stocks which have been which have been converted, these are referred to as special purpose vehicles, and we said these stocks which are there will be converted into various levels depending upon their risk, or in terms of the various risk which is involved. So these special purpose vehicles which are there were categorized into senior notes, mezzanine notes, junior notes, depending upon the amount of risk which is associated with the surety that you will be able to get in terms of the loans. And you will now be able to understand that the collateralized debt obligations which are there, CDOs, were the one which were actually being converted into special purpose vehicles, and these were sold in the stock markets throughout the world to governments, governments of mutual funds, everything else. And since people did not understand this collateralized debt obligations, uh, when the owners started not paying these EMIs, the very few people in the world actually understood that the stock prices of these special purpose vehicles which are there will come down, and they started doing short selling. Okay, they started selling it so that they can buy it at a later time at a very low price. And this is what led to 2008 financial crisis. And when you look at in terms of the value at risk, so my question always is, if I go for investment, the first question that I would like to ask is, tell me how much is the loss that might occur. Yeah, if you are able to give me like 95 percentage confidence, can you tell me with 95 percentage confidence how much is the loss that can happen within this day? So if you had invested 100 rupees, if you say that maximum you can lose is 50 paise, and the maximum gain that you can make is 2 rupees, something like that. So what you mean by this value at risk component or concept is nothing but it will be able to say that given in terms of the normal market conditions, what is the amount of loss that you might be able to incur during a specific period such as day, and thus value at risk does consider in terms of the time period, in terms of the confidence level, as well as how much is the amount of loss that you will be able to incur. And thus there are various methods that is followed. These statistical methods we have learned in the first semester itself, wherein the historical method, it says that history will repeat itself. That means if the losses in the previous day has been 2 rupees, the losses has been like 3 rupees. So based upon the historical data, I will be 100 or 95 percentage confident that the daily losses might not be able to exceed certain amount. This is called as historical method. I will variance covariance method or correlation method, as we know, we always say that the stocks will be able to uh, do as the economy does or the industry does. So if the BSE Sensex stock, BSE Sensex falls down by 5%, if the stocks also fall by 5%, we will be able to say that there exists negative correlation, and if it might be highly negatively correlated, or in terms of highly positively correlated. So depending upon that correlation value between the stock as well as the various other broader index, we will be able to decide. That is referred to as variance covariance method. And this if it is possible for me to create simulation, and based upon that simulation, if I am able to develop a model which will be able to tell me what is the amount of loss that I will be able to incur the very next day with a certain percentage of confidence, this is always referred to as Monte Carlo simulation. So this is what is the concept of value at risk, and these are the various concepts which are there in your module 5. And if you have any questions, you can revert back.